All right, there are three things we want to accomplish in today's recording. First of all, I want to review the infancy narratives that we looked at for last week, including going over some of the rows of the chart that I asked you to complete. Secondly, I want to introduce you an overview of Mark's writing style and his gospel. And then third, provide a comment or two about the three chapters from N.T. Wright's text that you're reading in conjunction with the reading from the Gospels for this week. As I mentioned in the email, it's probably best if you do the reading of N.T. Wright prior to your reading of Mark's Gospel and the excerpt from Luke that I'm asking you to do for this week. So in terms of the infancy narrative, again, the information on this slide is pretty much the same one you had last time, but just to kind of recap everything. Again, there is no infancy narrative in Mark or John's Gospel. Mark's Gospel, as you'll see this week, begins with Jesus already as an adult, beginning his public ministry. John's Gospel begins with a prologue, a very philosophical introduction to who Jesus is and what he's about. Matthew and Luke's versions, who do have birth stories of Jesus, are vastly different. And again, the point of this is to introduce us to the kind of Messiah that Jesus is going to be or is expected to be. Remember, Matthew and Luke are writing to very different audiences with different purposes in mind. So taking a look at the chart that I asked you to complete for last week, again, I'm not going to go over every detail of every row of the chart, but just to highlight a couple of examples here. The genealogy, first of all, the ancestry or family tree. In Matthew's gospel, the infancy narrative at the very beginning of Matthew traces Jesus back notably to David and Abraham, two of the major figures in Jewish history. Again, ultimately the ancestry or genealogy goes back to Abraham, who we would look at as being the first Jew. Now, why is that important? Think back to last time as well. Matthew is the only gospel written for a predominantly Jewish audience. And what he wants to say about Jesus is that he is a Jewish Messiah. On the other hand, Luke's gospel, written for predominantly Gentile Christians, is trying to portray the universal nature of Jesus as Messiah. And so his genealogy, which is not right at the beginning of chapter 1, verse 1, but I think comes at the end of chapter 2 or chapter 3, traces Jesus, yes, back to Abraham and David, just like Matthew, but he takes it back further. Luke will trace Jesus all the way back to Adam, the first human being, again, as a sign of our common humanity. Again, very much picking up on the kind of Messiah that Luke wants us to see Jesus as. Second row of your chart focuses on the third row in terms of who is the main character in the infancy narratives, not Jesus, and how is the news of Jesus' birth revealed and to whom. Matthew's gospel, the main character is Joseph. Joseph finds out that Mary is pregnant through a dream. If we had spent more time in the Old Testament, we would have read more about Joseph in the Old Testament, who also had the ability to interpret dreams. In Luke's gospel, Mary and Elizabeth are the two major characters in the infancy narrative, and they are, Mary at least is revealed to be the mother of Jesus through the visit of the angel Gabriel. We mentioned last time, we take that for granted, the fact that the opening chapters of Luke's gospel are going to focus on women, but yet in this time period in history when the gospel is written, that is a revolutionary concept, and that's the point of Luke. He wants to kind of shock us into realizing that this Jesus is going to be very different from all the other quote unquote would-be messiahs of his time period. He's kind of a revolutionary figure. Lastly, I wanted to mention who came and visited at the birth scene. So in Matthew's gospel, it's the Magi who come to visit baby Jesus and bring their gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. On the quiz last week, you had that trick question. The gospel does not say exactly how many magi come. Tradition is that it's three because of three gifts. The reality is the noun that's used there in the original Greek just is more than one. So whether it's 2, 5, or 10, we don't exactly know. On the other hand, in Luke's gospel, it is the shepherds and the angels who come and visit baby Jesus. Again, the sign here for Luke is you have heaven being represented by the angels, shepherds representing kind of the outcast of earth, and together they meet at Jesus. Again, that Jesus is a kind of Messiah who's going to unite earth and heaven. Back to Matthew for one other comment. The gifts themselves, gold, frankincense, and myrrh, which on the surface seem kind of strange, but they introduce us again to a little bit about the kind of Messiah that Matthew sees Jesus being. One, the gold, the gift you would give a king. Jesus is to be a king. Frankincense, something that's used in the temple, the idea that Jesus is a priest. Third, myrrh, the kind of strange gift. It would be the equivalent today of showing up at a friend's house for a baby shower and giving them the gift of a life insurance policy. It's a symbol of death. Myrrh was something that was used at burials. So Matthew is already telling us, yes, as a king of sorts, yes, as a priest of sorts, but in reality, already from his birth, Jesus is being prepared for his death. Luke does a similar thing, but in a different sort of way. In his infancy narrative, we're told that Mary wraps baby Jesus in swaddling clothes and lays him in a manger. I think it's in chapter 2, verse 7. Which is a foreshadowing to what we see at the end of Luke's gospel, where Mary is once again at the cross. This time, when Jesus' body is handed to her, it is again wrapped in cloths and laid in the tomb. So the birth scene becomes a kind of foreshadowing for the death scene. All right, so shifting gears now to introduce Mark's style. These are some things to watch for as you read Mark's gospel. First of all, Mark's style is a very fast-paced narrative. You will see the word immediately appear a lot in Mark's gospel. Some of the Bible translators will change that in different places to read as things like as soon as, or suddenly, or and then. But if you go back and read the gospel in the original Greek, it is still the same word that's being used. So it's kind of a calling card that we know that the same writer is writing the story. You'll also notice that many of the stories are kind of choppy. There's not a smooth transition from one event in the life of Jesus to another. I've sometimes said it's like listening to an excited 5-year-old tell you about their day. They're getting so excited to go from one thing to the next, it's not a polished narrative. The focus here is that Mark wants us to get to the Passion. That's going to be the key part of the gospel. That's where he's going to slow down and give us a lot more detail. So what we see in terms of Mark's use of space is 10 chapters for about 3 years of Jesus' life and 6 chapters for 6 days. And so you get a lot more of a sense of polished writing in the latter part of the gospel than you do in the beginning. Interestingly, I think also the word immediately you will continue to see appear even when the writing style seems to change later in the gospel. Second thing that you'll notice in Mark's style is the use of dramatic irony surrounding what's called the messianic secret. And these are two different concepts that I want to comment on. Dramatic irony is used very even often today in television shows where we, the audience, know something the characters on the set don't know. And in this case, we, the readers of the gospel, know something that the folks in the gospel don't know. That is, we know who Jesus is. Mark tells us in chapter 1, verse 1, that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. The characters in the gospel have to figure out who he is. Now, this relates to the second point of the messianic secret. As we read the Gospels, we have to journey along with the followers of Jesus as they're figuring out who Jesus is and the fact that Jesus wants to keep his identity a secret. He realizes, presumably, that by being a public figure, you're drawing attention to yourself, you're going to become a target, and so on and so forth. And so he doesn't want people to talk about publicly who they think he is. This also fits in with a Jewish cosmology of the time period, metaphysically speaking. And I'm going to tie this in with the next stylistic thing of Mark, which is the question of authority. The Jewish worldview of that time period saw the entire cosmos as a living thing constructed of layers. If you kind of visualize 5 layers, on the bottom you have plants and animals, above them you have humans, then you have forces of nature, then angels and demons, and on the top of the hierarchy you have God. And everything had power or authority over things below it. So enter Jesus into the picture. Jesus comes along and starts doing things that normal people can't do. He heals people. He controls forces of nature. He performs exorcisms and controls demons. So if you follow the cosmology and you think, well, wait a minute, this guy is clearly doing something that nobody else is able to do, metaphysically speaking, he must be greater than a human being. He must be greater than a force of nature. Perhaps he is a demon or something greater than a demon. Well, at the top of the hierarchy, you have God. And so the question is, if you're a Jewish person at the time period, is he God? Is he some sort of a super demon or a super angel, or where does he fit into this cosmology? That's really one of the questions the folks in the gospel have to struggle with. A second question that comes up about his authority is when he preaches and teaches. He often does things without citing proper authorities as Jewish rabbis would have done during this time period. So you'll find people in the gospel walking away after a miracle wondering, who is this guy, which is more of a spiritual question. And other times when Jesus teaches, they'll walk away scratching their head saying, by what authority can he do these things? So kind of keep an eye on that as you read Mark's gospel. Fourth, Mark's going to emphasize a very human portrait of Jesus. You're going to see a Jesus who cries, who gets frustrated, who gets angry, who feels pity, who shows compassion, who takes time to pray, who takes time to rest. These all kinds of human emotions. There's even one scene in chapter 1 of Mark where we're told that they bring to Jesus all who were sick and possessed, and he cured many. So he doesn't cure them all. But yet when we find that same passage told again in Matthew and Luke, we're told that they brought to him all who were sick and he cured all. So Matthew and Luke kind of clean up the story or change it to show Jesus as a complete healer. But Mark leaves it in there perhaps as a way to show that he can't do everything. Perhaps he gets tired. Perhaps he runs out of time. Perhaps he doesn't know even everything that he's doing this early in his public ministry. So he's limited very much in the things that he can do. Fifth, and the last thing in terms of Mark's style that you'll see is this idea of bracketing or framing. And Mark will use this in two ways to hold material together that's going to focus on a common theme. First of all, he'll use it where one story is inserted into another. So in chapter 5 of Mark's Gospel, Jesus will have an interaction with a guy named Jairus who comes and asks for Jesus to come and heal his daughter. And in the middle of the story, we have Jesus perform another miracle where he heals a woman who's been suffering from hemorrhages for like 12 years or some ridiculous amount of time. And after that healing, we go back to Jairus again. So it's this ABA pattern alluded to here on the slide. The point here is this whole chunk of material is meant to be understood together around one common theme. In this case, it's the power of faith and how the power of faith can lead one to be transformed. A second example of bracketing or framing that you'll see in Mark's Gospel is where you'll have a whole series of stories that are bookended or bracketed or framed around two parallel stories. You'll see example of this in chapters 8, 9, and 10 towards the end of your reading. In chapter 8, you have the story of Jesus curing a blind man at Bethsaida. And then in chapter 10, you have Jesus performing healing the blind man Bartimaeus. In between, you'll have a series of similar stories where Jesus predicts his passion three different times. Three different times the disciples misunderstand the kind of Messiah he is. And three different times he's going to have to teach them about who he is and what he's about. This whole chunk of material, chapters 8, 9, and 10, is meant to be understood together. And I'll address in next week's recording exactly what the significance is of this particular chunk of material. Finally, a couple of words about N.T. Wright and the reading from the three chapters that you are reading for this week as well. So in chapter 6, the chapter is called God's in Charge Now. And one of the big things that Wright is going to talk about here in this chapter is he's going to draw parallels between what Jesus is saying and doing and Moses. Watch for this, not only in the reading from Wright, but in the reading from the Gospels as well. There are 7 themes that Wright says: the wicked tyrant, the chosen leader, victory of God, rescue by sacrifice, new vocation and way of life, presence of God, and the idea of promised or inherited land. And Wright will kind of tease out the parallels of those 7 themes between the Old Testament and kind of spiritually what Jesus is doing in the New. It's a very, very important and key chapter you want to read carefully. Chapter 7, Wright is going to talk about miracles and the use of miracles in Jesus's public ministry. One thing that I want to mention is the Greek word for miracle in the Synoptic Gospels is dunamis, which is printed there on your screen, which is very similar in English to the English language, the word dynamite or dynamic. And the point here is that miracles are total transformations of the people who receive the kind of miracle or healing of Jesus. A couple of points from Wright. Wright mentions that miracles are signs of Jesus' authority, that a new campaign is starting, and that it's starting with God's authority, power, and blessing. One of the things Wright mentions as well in chapter 7 you'll read about is the sense of controversy that surrounds Jesus's public ministry, because in Jesus's day, if you were suffering in some way, if you were blind, if you were paralyzed, if you were possessed by demons, that you were being punished by God. And if it wasn't you that needed to be punished, it was your ancestors who sinned and was being punished. And so into the picture comes Jesus, and he not only heals them, but he equates forgiveness with that healing. And he takes away that authority that rested with the temple system to grant forgiveness or to God, and does it himself. Of course, we as Christians believe he is God, and so he's not really circumventing the temple in as much as he's just doing it himself. This challenges the worldview of those who witness these events. One of the things also that Wright mentions is that Jesus' miracles are not limited to the people of Israel, but to Gentiles and Samaritans as well. And again, this doesn't fit the expectations of traditional Jews during that time period. So forgiveness is included with healing. And finally, in chapter 8, a couple of points here. Again, this is where Wright is going to focus on parables and Jesus' teaching, his use of sermons, but I want to focus on the parable piece first here. Wright says parables have a speech act effect. This is on page 91, whereby telling a story creates a whole new situation or new world order. It's kind of like if you ever listen to somebody tell a story or a joke and you kind of start to anticipate where you think the story is heading. But in this case, it makes kind of a veer off at a 90-degree angle to a completely unexpected ending. And this unexpected ending forces you to kind of be shocked into a new worldview, a new way of looking at things. This is not where I thought the story was leading. Wright goes on to say on page 92 that parables often are more powerful in what they don't say than what they do say. And they're left, people walking away to kind of form their own conclusions about the lesson of the parable. Many of the parables, Wright says, were directed against the Pharisees. Those were the group of people that were very similar to Jesus from the Jewish temple system. Remember, we talked about those in class before. And so your discussion board this week, when you get to the end of the readings, is going to focus on the parable of the prodigal son. And so I want you to watch for both of those things there. One, the speech act effect. Again, what is the challenging or shocking punchline, if you will, of that particular parable? And secondly, being more powerful in what it doesn't say than what it does. Read the last paragraph of that parable very, very carefully when you get to it, and see if you can pick out the kind of unexpected ending there. I hope this recording helps focus your reading for this week, and I will be in touch and post the recording for next week. Take care, guys.